Welcome to part 2 of the A²I E²C annual showcase featuring the panel session.
We have Montse Ross, who's Associate Dean Education from the University of Wollongong, Peter Neal, who's an Education-Focused Champion from University of New South Wales, Helen Fairweather, Head of Accreditation from Engineers Australia, Zach Quince, who you met earlier, Centre for Teaching and Learning from Southern Cross University, and Sally Mail, Director, Teaching and Learning Lab, University of Melbourne. So we have some very talented and intelligent people on our panel with some very wise words to share. So the first question we have is, how are your institutions currently responding in terms of policy or academic guidelines to the rise of generative AI in engineering education? Are we seeing clear strategies, or are we still in the reactive phase? Are training and resources being produced? Now, this first question goes out to Sally.
Hello, Sasha. I'm Sally Mail, Director of the Teaching and Learning Lab in the Faculty of Engineering and IT at the University of Melbourne, and also editor of the Australasian Journal of Engineering Education. Yes, our university absolutely has been providing multiple levels of training, different lengths, different levels for staff across the university, some of them provided by the Computing and Information Systems and Teaching and Learning Lab staff. So the faculty has been able to provide a leading role, which I think is fantastic. And I think one of our main tools for sharing with each other and learning together has been the community of practice that is also led from our faculty. That's probably enough.
Okay.
And in terms of the assessment, you asked about the assessment.
Yep.
Yeah, 50%. We have very clear, it's just at least 50% of every subject, or you can do it at the course level, will need to be assured. And knowing, of course, that it's not really binary, things aren't really assured or not, but taking that limitation into account. And there's a progressive extent to which that has to be met over 3 years.
Excellent, thank you. Zach, what about your university?
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. So I don't think we're in the reactive phase anymore. I think a lot of institutions are now starting to settle down, but we are starting to see the pivots to kind of as Sally mentioned, 50% have to be secured. Obviously, SCU is a online educator. We can't really, secure learning in the same way that an in-person institution can. So we're very much looking at that programmatic course assessment level where we will hopefully be integrating more like year interviews and year hurdles to make sure that the students have actually achieved the designated learning. I think a lot of our resources are pretty much across the board, and mostly because at the moment I'm writing them all. So they go to all of the faculties across the university. A lot of staff development has occurred. We've recently launched a new staff module on assessment redesign, and we're currently benchmarking not only integration of GenAI into the assessments across the university, but also looking at where AI is actually taught in the curriculum. And that's more of the reactive stage at the moment is, yes, we've adopted it, but let's see at the course and at the unit level, where is this actually sitting? Where is it being taught? Where is it being assessed for learning?
Thank you very much, Zach. Let's move on to Peter.
Thanks, Sasha. Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm the Deputy Head of School for Education in the School of Chemical Engineering. And yeah, as Sasha mentioned, also keenly involved in the education-focused community here at UNSW. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of movement. Initially, there was sort of various training and things which was rolled out. I think there's still a lot of work to do. There's still colleagues that somewhat have their head in the sand a bit. And so needing to find ways that we can move all our colleagues along and get them to understand both the capabilities and the opportunities of generative AI. I think one of the other things that we're seeing is responding to AI has been subsumed into a broader project here at UNSW, thinking about program level assessment and how we actually redesign our assessments as a whole and the feedback processes that we use to make sure that we're actually assuring student learning at the stream and program learning outcome. So not just thinking about, okay, in this course, what are the, subject or unit, what are the assessment tasks that we're using, but how do all the different learning experiences that students have add up to their attainment of their program learning outcomes?
Okay, thank you, Peter. Let's move on to the next question. How do we identify which engineering competencies should remain human-led and which can be augmented or replaced by AI tools? Let's hear from Montse first.
Hi everyone, my name's Montse Ross. I'm the Associate Dean Education in the Faculty of Engineering and Information Sciences at the University of Wollongong. My background is in computer systems engineering and I used to teach a large first year programming subject, so I absolutely sympathise with our earlier speaker. But my interests have more recently moved towards the assurance of learning and helping students not excessively offload their cognitive load to tools. So that's a really good question you asked. How do we identify which engineering competencies should remain human-led? And obviously, a number of competency Engineers Australia Stage 1 competencies are heavily embedded in sort of the skills to communicate what you do more broadly. And there is starting to emerge some research around whether AI tools are actually hindering students' capacity to build their communication skills. And so I think those communication skills should remain firmly in the human-led aspect. We do need to develop those communication skills in our students, and certainly skills where judgment is required and accountability is of concern. So, if AI builds a bridge, but an engineer signs off on it and it doesn't and it falls, obviously the engineer is ultimately accountable. So I think looking through the competencies to determine what aspect can be offloaded. So there's a lot there around, a lot of the competencies talk about not just the design work, but then the documentation of that design work. Well, again, so documentation is something that's quite clearly going to be something that AI can assist us with. But we need to ensure that the engineers have the communication skills to review that documentation to ensure it is fit for purpose. So yeah, I think that's probably a little bit of an answer for that question.
Thank you, Montse. Helen, can you please provide your perspective?
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you for the invitation to present or to be on the panel today. So at this point in time, it's hard to imagine that all the engineering competencies that we currently have will still be required into the future. However, I'm not a futurist, but I do head up accreditation with Engineers Australia, and in that role I hold a weekly meeting with engineering academics from across universities in every state. Now, and Montse's on that meeting generally, and I didn't look who else was on there, but there's other people who contribute as well. Now we colloquially call this, or fondly call this group, the Brains Trust, and in recent weeks we've been focused on generative technologies, particularly in the context of accreditation. So many of the answers that I'm hoping I'll be able to, or many of the questions that you'll pose today, and hopefully in the answers I provide, will be informed by these and the previous discussions that I've had in that Brains Trust. In relation to this specific question, the general feeling was that all the competencies will remain human-led or require human intervention, as Montse alluded to there, but there will be an element of cognitive offloading across some of them, and the degree to which that cognitive offloading will be required will be across the three different competencies. So those are the three areas: knowledge and skills base is competency 1, engineering application ability is competency 2, and the professional and personal attributes is competency 3. So under each of those competencies, there are different elements. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Helen. So the next question is, what role do you see creativity and ethical reasoning playing in a Gen AI saturated engineering environment? Let's ask Zach first.
It's really hard to say, to be honest. I did write a bunch of notes down, and I'm going back and reading them, and it's the same thing again and again. I think ethics is obviously one in engineering education that we have had a lot of guidance on by Engineers Australia. The Code of Ethics has always been, something that I have always taught from first year all the way through to fourth year, because as an engineer's job, you must maintain, public perception, public safety. You've got make sure that you've got the right human judgment, and that you are transparent and accountable for your own actions. I think, again, as I said in my presentation, that academics will split down the middle as to whether Gen AI actually needs to be its own designator within the Code of Ethics. We've recently, last year, did a literature review and a bit of a study and went, well, it's reasonably covered by the Code of Ethics, but explicitly mentioned, no, obviously it's not. So there's still that ongoing discussion of, the guiding principles from Engineers Australia is going to guide some of these curriculum discussions. But I see creativity as one of those kind of things where it's, as long as engineers we are still teaching students and we're still educating students that have the critical thinking and the problem solving and the drive to actually want to do this, I don't see Gen AI tools limiting the creativity. I do see it augmenting creativity in terms of we might not see it processed in the same way. But I can very much see an enhancement in creativity.
Thank you, Zach. Sally, what about your opinions?
I think so. I've been feeling a bit like Zach, where I'm in agreement with all these things that everyone's been saying, and this is the first time where I'm going to contrast. I actually think that there's a massive risk to creativity with AI because, if we consider all of the information that a lot of the generative AI is relying on, it's going to be, biased towards places where where digital data are available, and the people who are more numerous among those. And as a consequence, if students and engineers rely too heavily on especially generative AI, then our creativity is likely to become globalized and homogenized, and the local and diverse elements might be less present. And so I think this is one area where we absolutely need to be doing, as many of the speakers have said, ensuring that our students use AI to support their learning and not to cognitively offload opportunities to strengthen their creativity muscles. So I'm sure that's not entirely inconsistent with many of the things Zach's been saying, but a slight contrast there on creativity. And in terms of ethics, just as Zach's been pointing out, and many of the other speakers, AI is providing tremendous opportunities that we didn't have before. I think they're way beyond efficiency. There are things that we can do with large quantities of data that we couldn't do before. And with the possibilities come immense risks which are exaggerated much further than they were before. And therefore, I think that the practices around checking and design reviews, checking a student checking their understanding, the skills for self-regulated learning, planning what they're going to learn, how they're going to learn, and checking that they have learnt, and also the skills as other speakers have said, checking the quality of an output, which is part of engineering practice already, but has been a part of engineering practice largely missing in education, needs to move into education in a much bigger way. So we need to be doing a lot more of supporting students to treat as part of their normal practice intentional processes to ensure the integrity of work, however it's done, to ensure that it's safe, inclusive, ethical, and sustainable. And that needs knowledge about how AI works as well, but also knowledge and processes that they can be familiar with for checking that they've considered the impact on unintentional impacts on stakeholders, the diversity of stakeholders, and so on.
Thank you, Sally. I really love a contrast. So is there a panelist that wants to add to that contrast?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because the issue of creativity is something that's come up in a number of forums that I have been discussing. And what we've already started to see, or what the feedback that I am getting from academic staff, is we are starting to see the blandification of assignments. So where students are, turning to various generative tools to assist them with writing, in particular written assignments, but the same thing could be done for coding. Typically, in the past, without tools, two students would sit down and write code, and there would be sufficient differences between the way they wrote their code or between their written work that it would be very, clear that this came from two different students. But nowadays, two students could sit down completely separately using generative AI tools and come up with an artifact each that is very similar. And so I'm also very concerned about the creativity element, that what Sally said about flexing their creativity muscles. Really liked that. I'm going to be using that from now on, Sally. It's really around making sure that we're teaching students that, yes, generative AI is something they can use. And in many cases, if generative AI can also help to prompt them to think about something that they wouldn't have thought about. So there's that aspect of creativity, helping them see something that they may otherwise not have considered. But if the use of generative technologies is just for the purposes of churning out an assignment to hand it in on time, we're all, like I said, the outcome of that is what we're starting to see in terms of this blandification of student submissions.
Thank you, Montse, for that point of view. I'm just going to go to a audience question that's received some support. I think this one here is tailored to Zach. How is online education will be made reliable in the age of generative AI? And I guess this leads to what will future education look like?
Yeah, and it's it's a big one as well. So a lot of as I said, a lot of in-person institutions, I can explicitly think of UQ, have said that they've got to have one assessment per course or subject or unit, whichever one you want to call it. You know, that is secure. It is in person. It is, some sort of talk, some sort of quiz, some sort of presentation that's in person, whatever. The thing with online education, and even if we go down that route of doing a Viva or something like that, I know that I use voice dictation in my AI tools, which means that as I'm talking to a student, they could be translating that content directly into an output and just regurgitating that. Obviously, there is, that didactic kind of, I guess, voice that the student will give that you go, hey, well, that's not really your voice and you're just reading that. But again, how can we prove that without this idea of getting into the student's computer? And again, even if you do that, then you've got a phone, etc. One of the examples, which obviously we can't really do in Australia, is in China when they went and had their national assessments. They actually turned off all the servers for the LLMs, which means that they couldn't actually use ChatGPT or their equivalent Gen AI tools. But it really is transforming online education, because we really are having to go towards that programmatic assessment type where we're going to have to get students to come on campus and say, this is your year one learning portfolio. Let's have a chat. Let's demonstrate some of those competencies so that we can actually sign you off, that we believe that you are competent in those areas. Obviously, with online education as well, we have the ability to do our residential schools. A lot of our academics are now shifting towards, hey, let's do that quiz on campus when you come and do this residential school. Or we go, well, if we can't secure your learning and you're an online student, let's put more work experience into your program. And that way you are then going into industry and getting examined in person by industry. And that's the way that we can tick you off. The issue with that obviously is, you take a large GO8 institution and you've got 2,000 first year students. How are you supposed to get industry placements for that many students? You can't really. So again, there are lots of issues. It is transforming, but we do need to start thinking about that evaluation, not in terms of the output, but in terms of the evidence of learning that they're going through as they're moving through these units. And I do believe programmatic assessment is a good way of going through that. And we do actually have an example from an online institution, specifically in engineering education, that is doing that at the moment as well.
Does the rise of generative AI fundamentally demand a shift in our engineering curriculum and competency frameworks? Or is this simply business as usual, where we treat Gen AI just as another tool like a calculator or CAD software? Or does it become a core engineering skill? Peter, what's your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Sasha. I think where we are is kind of in a state of disequilibrium. There's a lot of churn going on between, and I think it was useful to hear what Helen was saying with her brains trust, in talking backwards and forwards between, say, our industry and the profession and universities. We have a industry advisory board meeting coming up, and the big topic that we're going to be talking about is sort of sharing perspectives on AI in that. And I think that's going to be an important conversation to be happening at all levels, because I think what we're seeing at the moment is there's sort of early things that we're using AI for, particularly generative AI, in the production of documents and responses, as we've been discussing. But I think for me as a chemical engineer, what I'm really excited to see is how we can actually start using AI in creating really some of the really sophisticated technical documentation, and also as we go into design aspects where we can actually employ AI to really support us as we're doing sort of process simulations and process designs, equipment designs, and those sorts of things. So I think it's going to be sort of a way of working, if I can use that term. I think really fundamentally, and when I read, say, the national competency standards for engineers and the stage 1 competencies and things, being an engineer, it's about being a particular thing, having a certain set of knowledge, skills, experiences, but also thinking processes. And that's an internal thing to the psyche of the individual that we want to create in students. So I think the way that where AI is actually going to sit as we think about our curriculum and think about the competency standards is it's actually going to be about redefining the how of the statements on apply, identify, engage. All those verbs that we use in our curriculum, in our learning outcomes, and in our competency standards, the AI is actually going to sit in the how do we apply, how do we identify, how do we design, rather than becoming a separate thing that sort of sits alongside or replaces some of the stuff that we already do.
Thank you, Peter. Helen, what about your thoughts?
The issue between the issue about what employers are expecting and how we need to change the curriculum has been very topical of late, and Sally might like to talk to it because I know that she's been doing a lot of some research in that area. But I do think it's a critical area of research that we really need to ramp up. However, the employers are probably looking for what we do as engineers and how we do it. So they're probably not, and will be less focused on that knowledge transfer. So in the competency 1 bucket, for example. But those competencies in the 2nd and 3rd buckets rely on the development of those first competencies. So I guess there's a mismatch between what industry is expecting and how we develop those competencies, which to some extent has always been there. Employers have always said that they want the engineering graduates to hit the ground running. And Anish, I think it was, mentioned the lifelong learning requirement for engineers. And again, that's always been there. And it's always been an expectation that industry will take a role in that. So that possibly becomes more pronounced. So, we currently require those professional and personal attributes. Employers are always looking for them, but perhaps as generative technologies continue to evolve, we will perhaps be expecting to see those competencies or those elements in those competencies being even more developed than they currently are. So essentially, if we think that the knowledge and skills base will still be required, but we perhaps need to change the focus on how they are developed to achieve those competencies in application ability and the professional and personal attributes. But then there's another sort of tension there, I suppose, in that generative AI is likely to be more evident in that first competency. And so how do we develop that expertise in that competency that evolves to such an extent that we can be confident that the student is developing the second competency in the application ability independently? So I think, I hope that answers the question, and I haven't rambled on too much, but I might leave it there.
That's good. Montse, how about your opinion? Thank you.
Yeah, look, if I understand your question, it's basically, is generative AI a fundamental change to our curriculum and competency frameworks, or is it do we treat it like another tool? And I'm going to give a cop-out answer and say it's both. So I'm going to say that on the one hand, it is like any other tool. It's an introduction of a tool. Education professionals, primary education professionals, have spent the last 40 years debating about whether calculators should be allowed in year 1, year 2, year 3, primary school at all. And so the introduction of a tool, and from what I understand, I believe it's in the New South Wales curriculum from year 3 onwards, although it can be introduced earlier if they want to. But there is a sort of, not everybody's not convinced, but there is a sort of there is a majority view that actually students benefit from learning addition and subtraction and these sorts of concepts without the calculator first in year 1, using their fingers, their toes, Lego blocks, whatever it is that they need to do to understand the fundamental competencies before calculators get introduced. So from the perspective that generative AI is just another tool, yes, that nothing's changed there. It's up to us as educators to then sit down and work out what are the fundamental competencies we would like to see our students exhibit before we introduce generative AI as a tool. And maybe it's the case that most of year 1 is under, non-Gen AI conditions where students need to demonstrate the fundamentals in calculus and programming and physics and various other things. And from year 2 onwards, that's the appropriate point. Who knows? Well, I'm not specifying anything in particular, but I guess my answer to your question is, from the one perspective, yes, it is like any other tool. It's up to us as educators to determine how and when we introduce it to our curriculum. But on the other hand, there is an exceptionalism issue here. Unlike a calculator, unlike basic software tools, generative tools and generative AI in particular has the ability to mimic human creative endeavour to a scale we've never seen before. And harking back to Peter's comment earlier about actually being an engineer is about thinking like an engineer. I think this actually demonstrates the flaw in our assessment and the way we have been assessing up to this point. In the past, we've assessed students by way of the artifacts that they submit, with the assumption that the critical thinking occurred for that artifact to come into existence. So we were evaluating the creative thinking, the deep thinking and the creative endeavor by way of the artifact that got submitted. And so now it's far too easy to use this tool to mimic creative thinking and human endeavor that would have taken you 10 hours, 15 hours, 2 weeks to do in a couple of seconds. And so this is where, like I said earlier, my interest is in ensuring that students use AI responsibly without excessively offloading their cognitive offload. So yeah, that's my cop-out dual answer to your question.
Thanks. Zach, did I see your hand raised for a comment?
Yeah, I did just want to raise a point if I could. We talk a lot about competencies and about, industry use and things like that. One of the big things that I'm actually seeing emerging is the inequalities between the ways different industry and companies are embedding the tools and using them. Large consultancy firms have got their own internal servers. They've gone and bought GPT-4, and now they've got their own versions where even the defense wings can go use it. You go into smaller, more private enterprises, and they're basically unable to use a lot of them because they don't have that ability to use internal servers. They don't have kind of the training and the resources to train up engineers in that area. So for me, it's very important as well that when we talk about competencies, that we're not over pitching so that we get students that have developed all of these Gen AI and AI literacy, and then they get into the workforce and they go, nope, you've got to go back and type it all yourself, and they go, well, uh-oh. So that's just again one of those thoughts of but what if?
That's great, Zach. Let's move to a popular audience question. We have one here from Sam. What is the most important thing, Helen, that you would like to see institutions focus on over the next 2 years?
I'll start by saying, as you would expect me to, accreditation is outcomes based. So, saying that I won't be giving a definitive answer in terms of this is what universities should be developing or implementing. But I think it's pretty clear that there are some themes that have emerged over the last couple of years and through this panel today around how we are able to develop the critical thinking skills in students in the face of generative technologies. And I think that being able to that universities, and I know that everybody is doing this because they're all responding to Texas requirement for an action plan to demonstrate how they're going to address the generative AI proliferation. But the demonstration that the students or the graduates still have that highly developed critical analysis skill level, I think is going to be a really important focus for universities in facing this challenge. How they do it, there will be many different approaches, I hope, to that. And we wouldn't be stipulating whether one approach would be better than the other. The other area I think that's becoming more critical, and we already require this, but I think we're going to require it at perhaps a more focused or in a more focused way, is that feedback from industry on what the graduate skills are that that they're required in the workplace, keeping in mind those diverse graduate outcomes that Zach pointed to for different companies, because of the different levels of investment that the companies can make in those tools. But I think that in the context of that, though, the universities need to ensure that the development of those underpinning knowledges aren't diluted in response to what industry is looking at. And so that's a huge challenge. So I don't have any answers, just more questions, really. Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you, Helen, for that response. All right, let's move on to our next question. And it's an important one. It connects pretty much most of the themes that we've talked about. And that is, how should engineering assessments evolve to validate both technical and human-centered competences in the age of generative AI? Sally, what are your thoughts on that?
Some of the points others have made already, Montse was just making one of them. We've got to be really careful because the outputs, a student can trick themselves, and assessors, if we are assessing outputs only, we need to be supporting students to use AI to develop their self-regulated learning and assessing the processes they use and their ability to learn and that kind of thing. So here, I think that means, yes, we still have to test some of the basic skills, as Monty also pointed out, the fundamental knowledge and so on. But I think that we need to consider ourselves now to be in one big, massive learning community. And that includes, and the learning community is to work out how we're going to reshape engineering practice. And in our case, that's through engineering education and research in the age of AI. And that means we need to have a lot more engagement in our curricula, and that is something that we've all been trying to enhance anyway, but we really need to do this now. It's even more important. We need engagement in our learning activities and our assessments, which can be still embedded into the learning activities, and probably more so need to be, where we have our researchers engaging with the teaching and engaging also with the industry people and community members and our students. We're all bringing different perspectives in this learning community. We all need to learn together, and then we need to contribute to shaping engineering practice through that. And so we need to be using a lot more project-based learning and other kinds of industry and research engaged learning activities, and assessing, changing our rubrics so that we are assessing things that happen in the learning activities, the ways that students engage in the learning activities and learn and demonstrate competencies that way. People will say it's not scalable. It is scalable. I had rubrics that in electrical and electronic engineering design project subjects where students were working in teams with industry engaged, with partners who were in industry, and the students were going into the workplace. It just takes redefining the rubrics, not just, it's a lot of work, redefining the rubrics, and also making sure that whoever's doing the assessment is also, there's a lot of reliability across the large numbers of assessors you're going to need, and that they're working with the students. They know the students. It's not always going to be possible in every, there'll be adaptations, as Helen has said. How exactly it works will be different in different universities' contexts, but it's possible, and that's where I think we should be heading.
Thank you very much, Sally. Peter, you've done a lot of work in this area. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. And I think just to pick up on what Zach was talking about earlier, I think a fundamental assumption that we've been making in this whole discussion is that our students want to use AI. And I think one thing is that there is a section for our students that the ethical concerns that Zach's raised around IP, around the environment and things, leads them to a point where they fundamentally disagree with using AI. And so that is a question that we need to negotiate, both as we talked with industry expectations about the capabilities of our students when they leave, and negotiating that with them, and helping and talking with our students and understanding where the concerns come from, and how, as Zach's and the work Zach's been doing, how we can think ethically about the use of AI. So I think that's an important thing. It's important for us, if we're trying to be inclusive in the way that we design our learning, to actually take that up and be prepared for that conversation. I think another thing, building off what Sally was saying, a lot of our assessment techniques that we train each other up in are around the marking of artifacts, as we've discussed. And this shift into wanting to think more about the process and how we understand the process. And as someone said to me recently, well, when you talk about process, you're just talking about more artifacts. They're just artifacts that are created in the journey to the final thing. But I think the fundamental skill that we'll need to do more work in and equipping all teachers in is about observational skills. One of the things I feel is, if I go into, say, a lab class and want to observe how students are performing in the lab, is that I'm going to have an observer effect on the way that the students are performing. That they're going to there's going to be this pretense of teamwork, rather than just being able to observe the true nature of the student interactions. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting way that we need to equip our teachers. The other thing, I think, as we've mentioned before, is the sort of program level or programmatic, depending on which university you're at, approaches to assessment, and thinking through the key thing that we're looking for, as Helen mentioned, is the outcomes at the end of the degree, and making sure we have competent engineers who are knowledgeable and have the attributes that we expect. And so thinking back from that point and thinking what are the gates and the milestones that the students have to pass through in order to demonstrate to us, to demonstrate to the profession and to the broader community that they're competent, is going to be the key thing in the way that we do assessment into the future.
Thanks, Peter. Some great responses, including on the chat. I've been monitoring the chat, and some good side discussions occurring there as well. Montse and Helen, you recently published an article on integrity strategies beyond assessment. There appears to be no perfect solution. What are some of your key takeaways, and what are the key challenges for accreditation?
Well, I mean, I can probably give a brief. So, I mean, briefly, I think the first finding, or the first thing that we pose in that paper, is that banning GenAI is not an option. I think we need to face those staff, our colleagues, who think that you can just ban your way out of this problem. I think that's probably the number one issue. So then it comes back down to what are the different strategies that we can look at. And certainly, I mean, programmatic assessment is one of the strategies that has been spoken heavily about. I'm not a huge fan of the whole creating, I guess my issue with programmatic assessment is around the fact that if you are creating a single voce viva at the end of a year to see if the student has learned everything in all their subjects, what happens when they fail that voce viva? So that's my biggest concern around programmatic assessment. I understand that it is very applicable in certain areas. Our own medical school, for example, uses programmatic assessment, but the consequences of failing at certain points means they get chucked out of the program and they don't come back. Like that's some pretty serious consequences. And so I'm less in favor of, high stakes. So anyway, so one of the strategies in our paper was gatekeeper subjects, which is kind of a similar sort of idea. But ultimately, I think the way forward, we're going to have to accept, obviously, that there are going to be assessments which are going to be secured, and there are going to be assessments which are going to be unsecured. And as Zach correctly pointed out, this is going to have to be an institution by institution decision about how they go about their mix. I do think that one of the concerns that people have around unsupervised assessment is the graded nature of that. So where you have a supervised assessment, you've got everyone in an exam, you can say, right, I'm going to grade this on a bell curve or whatever it is, or that you're going to do. I'm going to be able to hand on my heart say that this student achieved a HD level and this student achieved a pass level. And I think a lot of the concern that I'm seeing in academics in particular, and this is more anecdotal, is that when they set a take-home assessment or an unsupervised assessment where they know that some students are going to use generative AI regardless of whether you say they can or can't. And then you've got inequalities between those that are using the free version of ChatGPT 3.5 or the whatever it is, the $20 version or something that's GPT-4, and then the $200 a month, or I don't know what it is, some ridiculous amount for GPT 4.5. And so I think what we investigated in the paper is looking at different mechanisms by which we can evaluate. You could have adaptive grade scaling where students are brought in if their supervised marks are significantly different to their unsupervised marks, for example. That was one of the cases. But I think institutionally, there is going to be there are going to have to be decisions made, and I personally can see us moving to a more competencies-based assessment for unsecured assessments. So because it is difficult to put our hand on our heart and say, for this take-home assignment, this student achieved a HD and this student achieved a pass, when all we're doing is looking at the artifact that they created for the aforementioned reasons that I talked about earlier. So yeah, I think I don't think there is one answer, as you correctly said, Sasha. I think it is going to be quite nuanced, and it is going to be different institutions, depending on whether they're largely, so you've got on-campus versus online, but you've also got online synchronous versus online asynchronous. So those are two completely different things as well. And there are going to have to be different strategies to, again, be able to put our hand on our heart that this student has assured this learning outcome. I think the strategies are going to differ from instance to instance.
Thanks, Montse. Helen, what about your perspective?
Yeah, look, there are a myriad of challenges that we're facing and trying to come to grips with how we evolve accreditation at the same speed and scale that's evident in what's happening in the universities. And that at the same time, we've got the constraint of the speed and scale of change that needs to happen at that international level, because Engineers Australia competencies need to meet those graduate attributes that are part of what they call the GAPCs, the graduate attributes and competency standards that are published by the International Engineering Alliance. So we in Engineers Australia, we accredit under, as I'm sure you all know, under the 3 accords, the Washington, Sydney and Dublin Accords. And, I think there are 26 signatories under the Washington Accord. So all of those signatories have to agree to this change at those graduate attributes. But on the same hand, we can have take a lead in forcing that change to happen a little bit more quickly than it might otherwise, when you've got that amplified inertia, if you like, from having so many bodies involved. One of the changes that I've seen already, and I remember I wrote a mandatory requirement not too long ago around reflection, and saying that the students needed to reflect on how they develop their competencies through their engagement with professional practice. Well, now that's very much an ability of GenAI. And so how do you know that the student is actually doing that? So again, I have no answers, just lots of questions. And I think I'd also like just to touch on, because it was brought up at our in the Brains Trust meeting, and once he alluded to it, and I love the term blandification. I don't like what it does, but I hadn't considered this before, and I tested that in a workshop that Sally and I were at last week. So the Brains Trust members of the Brains Trust said that they'd seen this blandification in their students. submissions, and it was confirmed in that room that Sally and I presented at. So that is a real challenge, because the last thing you want is a uniformity of thinking evolving, because the research up until this point, and part of the increasing the diversity in the workforce is based on the understanding that that diversity is critical for improving how we do our work as engineers. They're just some of the challenges, Sasha. Thank you.
Thank you. Montse, did you remember something else you want to say?
Yeah, well, Helen just reminded me. So what she mentioned about having to integrate with the sort of other countries as well, and in terms of the competencies. Certainly, the feedback that we've had is that there, with our offshore campuses, is that there are cultural differences to the way generative AI tools are viewed at some of our, offshore, with some of our offshore colleagues, and there is definitely a slightly more rigid approach, shall I say, to moving towards, online, on-campus final exams, et cetera, because of that concern. And it was interesting to hear, I can't remember one of the speakers who mentioned earlier about how they shut down their whatever DeepSeek or whatever model servers, which is quite interesting. But on this blandification topic, yeah, I think we need to ensure that students understand that AI is not doing the thinking for them. AI is predicting what the next word will be on the basis of a large language model. So it stands to reason that what it produces will blandify over time. And as more AI generated content appears on the internet, that is only going to accelerate. So I do have major concerns around the views of, so marginalized or vulnerable people views in society more generally outside of engineering education. But as it pertains to engineering education, we really need to also educate our students that this thing that's helping you craft artifacts for your engineering degree is not thinking for you. It's telling you what it thinks the next word should be. It's no different to a predictive text tool on your mobile phone that tells you what it thinks the next word will be. The decision is still made by yourself. You're still taking accountability for choosing to decide to take that word. And likewise, the decision to take whatever AI outputs and submit that as your assessment, that decision is yours. That decision belongs to the student. So I think that's where a lot more of that education needs to fall.
Okay, thank you, Montse. One last question. I've got one here from the audience. Generative AI changes rapidly and affects how engineering work is done. How can universities ensure curriculum and accreditation keeps up with those changes in the future? Zach, did you have any thoughts into that question?
Yeah, I think as we're going through and doing all of these changes across the degree and curriculum, and of course we're still trying to pivot to the 2035 report as well at the same time as we're going through all of this. I think we need to have that future focused, and I answered a question in the chat, which was, should GenAI be in the competencies as a singular item? And my response was, I think it does fall under that emerging tools. For the time being, it probably does need to be a descriptor in the attainment indicators. But we do need to think about kind of what are the changes, or what are the future proofing that we can do now. And I do think programmatic assessment does kind of cover off on all of that, because if we are able to say that the student has learnt this at these key intervals or key steps, then it doesn't matter what tools or technology is then being incorporated, because we have that assurance at that level.
Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. I think the other thing here that's going to be about that's going to affect in terms of how universities respond is that I have a colleague who's a structural engineer. He runs his own consultancy, and he's in this position where now, if he's hiring junior staff, he has a real question between Well, there's going to be a lot of investment in that junior staff member to actually bring them up to the level of quality that he wants from his products and the designs that he's doing, versus actually employing AI to create similar sorts of things, particularly in areas where you're really closely following Australian standards. Those Australian standards are written in a very procedural way, and they're the sort of perfect things for AI to follow. And so there's actually a question of competitiveness of our graduates, and what is the role of a graduate engineer going to be in the future. And that's a really key thing that we need to be thinking about as well, because in some ways, what is an employable graduate is going to change. It's a similar. So when AI first came out, one of the conversations was, well, maybe what we used to call a credit is now just a passing standard. And so there's sort of AI creates a ratchet up in terms of what is a sort of acceptable performance from students, and that also has an effect in what is an acceptable level of competency for a graduate engineer as well. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to follow and look at what are the employment levels of our graduates as they leave university.
Each panel member, just to give us your final reflection, your final takeaway. Let's start with Sally.
Oh, just so many questions. It's scary. Scary and exciting. That's it.
Montse?
Yeah, there was another comment in the chat about the whole blandification, and I think this is a real threat, not to like engineering education necessarily, but to society as a whole. I mentioned that this is something that the arts and visual arts and music in particular have been struggling for a while. But even when you consider scientific advancement in the past occurred because somebody thought outside the box and did something truly brilliant. And my concern is that as AI creeps into our schools and as students start to think that learning means looking at AI output, that we are going to dampen those sparks of sheer brilliance that are what push society forward. That's my concern.
Thank you. Zach?
I think I'm at the same point with Sally. I gave a response a little earlier in a session a few days ago, which was give me one word to sum up how you're feeling, and my response was yep. I think that's pretty accurate for this one as well. So yep.
Peter?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things is just continuing conversations. We've been talking about the relationships in industry and with the profession and within university, with our colleagues, with our students, because we're all at different points in our understanding and our skills in using AI, or our sort of attitudes to AI. And I think like just in my role as deputy head of school, I know there are colleagues in my school that are really advanced in how they're using AI, and there's other ones that are still sort of saying, selecting the option in our course outline that says you are not allowed to use AI in this assessment. And my response to them is, how can you stop that? So I think really continuing to talk about this and find lots of different ways that we can be engaging with our students and our colleagues is going to be really important going forward.
Thanks. And Helen, lucky last.
I'm also in this, well, I feel like I have a cognitive dissonance because, you know, I embrace AI and use it quite a lot, or GenAI, I should say. But I recognize that it has created a feeling of overwhelm for me in terms of responding to the scale and rate of change. And I can also, and look, this may be just a result of my aging brain, but I've got a concern that is my use of it already diminishing my ability to critically think of an answer, you know, in a situation like this, because there's so much there. There are so many moving parts. So I think cognitive dissonance describes how I feel.
Excellent. All right, thank you. That concludes the formal part of this presentation. If